part one of the book of Ruth is a setup of the entire story. In part one, the first part of part one is the first part of Act 1 is an overview of the shape of the story. It introduces the theme of the story, it introduces the story goal, and shows us the overall shape that the plot will take. The theme of the book of Ruth is from fruitfulness to emptiness to fullness. That's the shape of the story. So we have the main characters, Naomi especially, starting from a state of fruitfulness when they are in Israel. This is part of their backstory. They have come to a place of emptiness. They will come to a place of emptiness in the story and then back to a place of fullness. And that is the overall shape of the story. The goal of the story, as we'll see, is to bear the ruler of Israel. So in the book of Micah, chapter 5, verse 2, there's a verse that talks about out of Bethlehem will come the ruler. And we will see later in this story, spoilers, that that Naomi and Boaz, Naomi's line is the line through which, well, Naomi's husband's line, Elimelech's line, is the line through which Jesus will eventually come. King David and then King Jesus will come, and so the king will come from this line. So the whole goal of this story is to bear a son who will be an ancestor of the king. That's the story goal. The setup, part one, is a place of setup. So when we have a little bit of a we want to locate the story in a time and in a place. So the first verse begins by locating the story in the time of the judges. It is when the judges rule. It tells us a bit about that time. In particular, when this story was written, it was a time of famine. There was a famine in the land. And the particular place there's Israel, but more specifically Bethlehem, in the place of Judah. And we zoom in even more, it's the place Ephraim within Bethlehem. They start in Bethlehem, Ephraim, and then they travel to Moab, and that's a place outside of Israel. The Moabites were the descendants of Lot, and they became antagonistic to the Israelites. So they became a separate people, and they were no longer friends. We are introduced to the characters. In this part of the story, we hear about Elimelech, Naomi, and their two sons, and their two daughters-in-law. And the backstory that we hear about is that there is a famine that caused them to leave Ephraim and go into Moab. So there are lots of symbols and themes in this part of the story. A lot of the themes of the book are hinted at through symbolic names, and the meanings of the names, I think, are very important in this story. So let me just run through a few of those names that are quite symbolic. So first of all, Judah. What is the significance of Judah? Well, when we read Genesis chapter 50, I think it is, one of the last chapters of Genesis, Jacob blesses his sons. He has 12 sons. He takes Joseph's sons to be his sons. So we get 12 tribes of Israel, but the two half tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. And that's beside the point. But we have one of those tribes is Judah. So one of Jacob's sons is Judah. The sons of Jacob, or Israel, is Judah. And the promise to him was that out of him would come the king. So Judah means praise, and out of Judah comes the king. So the we see in this story part of how there was a little hiccup in that bringing forth a king, and how that was overcome. The story goal is to overcome that hiccup and to actually bring forth a descendant for Naomi, who will eventually give birth, beget, I guess is the word, a king. So Bethlehem, the place where they come from, literally means house of bread, which is ironic because, as we see in this story, they have no bread. There is a famine. So it gives us a sense already that things are not the way they should be. Bethlehem should be a house of bread, but there's a famine. We also see in the name Ephrathah, which means fruitful, but again, there's a famine. So Bethlehem, Ephrathah, they're places where there should be fruitfulness happening, but there isn't. And I think symbolically, we see this as a spiritual famine as well, by the hint given that it was in the time of the judges. So there was a physical famine in that they had no food, but there was a spiritual famine at the time as well, because the book of Judges had a refrain that is repeated over and over, where they had no king. In those days, everyone did what they wanted because they had no king. And that led to the cycle of apostasy, where Israel forgot God, they rejected his ways, they went and bowed down and followed other gods. Then they would lose God's protection and the other nations would come in, because Israel was a very small nation compared to those around them, and the other nations would come in and they would oppress them and they would make war with them. And then Israel would remember God and they would repent and they would cry out to God for help, and God would send someone, one of the judges, to save them, and they would be saved and they would have some peace. Then they would forget God again, and they would lose God's protection, and the nations would come in, and so on, and the cycle would repeat, the cycle of apostasy. So we have the physical famine, but we also have a spiritual famine in the land as well, because of people's apostasy and their following of other gods instead of the one true God. Another name that we read about is Moab. So the history of Moab is that Moab came from the descendants of Lot. So in Genesis, when Abraham and Lot were together, their households had become so big that the land could no longer support both of them. So they separated. Lot chose to go one way, and so Abraham took the other direction. And Lot ended up in Sodom, which eventually got destroyed, and then he moved to the hills. He was unwilling to go to live with other people anymore because of what just happened, presumably. And so he lived with his two daughters alone in the mountains, and his two daughters really wanted to have kids, and they had kids with their father. And Moab, which was the name of one of these children, is Moab became a whole nation, and the name Moab literally means from the father. And I guess thematically, I might be reading a little bit into it here, but it's kind of a distortion of how things should be, in the sense that if this is a story about Israel having a king and a father of the nation, that's God being king. Maybe I am reading too much into this, but we have Moab who is from the father. In any case, Moab is the name given to the Moabites, the name given to this nation that reminds, it's a constant reminder of the beginning of that nation, how it started. And historically, they were always, that they have been at odds with Israel. So Elimelech is the name of Naomi's husband. Elimelech means literally, my God is king. And that is, again, so it's the theme of the Bible. So we have my God is king, we have Judah and the promises to Judah. We have these royal themes, these kingdom themes that are coming through in these names. Naomi means pleasant, and she actually changes her name to Mara when she loses everything, when she comes to a place of emptiness because she feels that her life is not pleasant, and she just sinks into despondency. But interestingly, nobody else calls her Mara, which she asked everybody to call her. It seems like her friends or the narrator of the story didn't believe that her life actually was bitter, maybe. So her life did go to a place of emptiness and a place where she no longer considered it pleasant. But nobody else had that viewpoint. None of the other characters or the narrator took that viewpoint. Then we have the names of the two sons. So this is another indication that things are not the way they should be. So Mahlon means sickness, and Chilion means weak. And if the story goal and if the purpose of Elimelech is to beget someone who will eventually beget the king, then we see that his descendants, Mahlon and Chilion, who are named sickness and weak, we see that the line of Judah, that line that will lead to a king, isn't as strong as it could be. And then we have the names of Orpah and Ruth. And Orpah means fawn, and we don't really hear much about her. And Ruth means a compassionate friend, and we see that she is Ruth by name and Ruth by character. So she is a loyal and compassionate friend to Naomi throughout the whole story, and she helps Naomi to achieve her husband's story goal. So her husband's purpose was to beget a son, and Naomi gave up at some point. Ruth stuck with her and helped her in that. So there's some of the themes. And in this first part of Act 1, it's important to see the shape of the story. And so this is so from fullness to emptiness, back to fullness. We see this in miniature, in that opening sequence that we see where they start off in the land of Israel, and we see words like Bethlehem and Ephraim, which hark back to a time of lots of bread and lots of fruitfulness, and the names like Judah, which talk about a kingly theme of expectation that a kingdom will soon come about. And then it goes to a place of emptiness when they come to Moab, and so there's a famine, and they come to Moab in a place of emptiness, and for a time they're okay. So it's the story's, the initial problem is not going to be completely filled in this opening sequence, but we kind of see that shape in that opening sequence where we have reminders of the fullness that was, the emptiness, and then kind of a partial fulfillment to show us that overall shape. So that is it for part 1 of the story of Act 1, and I'll see you in part 2, hopefully.